year 1993.
1993 was an excellent year for the big screen, but what about the small screen? Well, as it turns out, there were some very memorable shows that made their debuts this year. As I've said over and over again, how much the 1990s were washed with sitcoms galore, and this year, there were some standouts that came to pass. First, we start off with a double dose of Saved by the Bell. This was the original class minus Lisa and Jesse, who would graduate from high school and end up making their way to college. The setup was the same, but with two new girls added to the lineup. Zach, Slater and Screech carried on with their high school shenanigans, but with a more sophisticated feel to it. The lads move into a dorm room shared with three other girls. Alex and Leslie are the newbies to this group. We did have a third girl in Essence Atkins as Danielle in the first episode, but then she was written out by the second episode and replaced by Kelly. Mike Rogers was the dorm supervisor and was the parent figure of the group. There was no Mr. Belding this time, save for one guest appearance, but taking his place was Dean McMahon, played by Two and a Half Men's Holland Taylor. The show was designed to be a primetime show, but with stiff competition from Full House and other major network shows, the college year suffered with very poor ratings, and after just one solo season, it was unfortunately cancelled. They did rectify the end of this class by creating the made-for-TV movie Saved by the Bell Wedding in Las Vegas, where Zach and Kelly finally got hitched. The show had its funny moments. It was never going to reach the heights that was set by their high school adventures. Personally, I find it a guilty pleasure to watch when going through retro TV shows. Saved by the Bell, the new class, also released this year, and by all accounts it was really a retread of the original characters from the original Saved by the Bell, which went on to have several cast changes over the course of a 7-year run, and that was quite an eye-opener. I'd personally say it had a few memorable spots, like when the original cast met the new class, but the show had more than outstayed its welcome. The whole idea and concept of continuing the Saved by the Bell franchise with a new high school cast and then college trials and tribulations looked good on paper, but in reality it was never going to match up to the original Saved by the Bell. Next on the sitcom list is one of my personal favourite shows of all time, Boy Meets World. The story about a young boy, Corey Matthews, and his unique look on life as a child, a teenager, and a young adult. This was one of those sitcoms that after the first view, I was hooked for life. And indeed, it was a very enjoyable and memorable show, the main hook being the romance between Corey and his girlfriend Topanga. Against all odds and the usual stereotypes, the two managed to stay a couple with a few breakups in between, and then eventually end up getting married. And then years later they would have their own spin-off show with their own children. The show dealt with many socially relevant issues like broken marriages, alcoholism, poor upbringings, sibling rivalries, and relationships. Now, for a sitcom that was very light-hearted in nature, it did cover some very deep subjects. And I personally foolishly believed that Corey and Topanga's relationship could be replicated in real life. Oh, how naive I was. The show did have plenty of laughs, many thanks to Eric and his tomfoolery. And like I said already, one of my personal faves that I still enjoy to this very day. Living Single made its debut this year, and it broke the mold of what was a typical black sitcom. In sitcoms past, we had shows with token black characters that made their mark. We already had The Cosby Show, which had a married couple dealing with the trials and tribulations of having 5 children. A Different World, with the kids moving on to college and dealing with the ups and downs of college life. So this show was the adults moving on to the next stage in life, which was having jobs of their own and making their own path of success in life. Even though you had Queen Latifah as the standout due to her massive popularity, the show at large was an ensemble with all 6 characters, each bringing their own unique personas to the table to create one great big mashup. It had tons of laugh out loud moments, which were goofy and campy, and well thought out in nature. Life lessons like dealing with personal identities, the hardships of creating a successful business, matters of the heart in the case of Overton and Sinclair, who managed to hook up in the first season and stay together for the rest of the show, proving that there is such a thing called true love. Black characters were also portrayed very positively in the show, so instead of the middle-class working man struggling to make ends meet, Most of the characters in the show were very successful with their jobs, like Maxine Shaw as a high-powered attorney, Kyle Barker as a stockbroker, and Overton Wakefield Jones as the handyman. If you haven't seen my video on Living Single, I recommend you go give it a watch. It was a show that I didn't grow up with until around 2018, when I watched it for the first time and then binged the whole series, and it holds up very well indeed. And it has become one of my all-time personal favourite sitcoms. A true classic in every sense of the word. Rounding off the sitcom run, we end with Frasier. This was a spin-off from 80s classic Cheers. It is not very often that a spin-off goes on to match and even surpass its predecessor, but this show did just that. It's about the character Frasier, who made his debut in Cheers, and lives his life in the city of Seattle, where he makes his living as a radio host giving psychiatric advice to his listeners and his patients. He also reconnects with his retired police officer father and his younger brother Niles, who wolf-eared listeners would recognize as the voice of Sideshow Bob from The Simpsons. Now, like Mad About You, Frasier was not one of those sitcoms that I watched religiously. I caught some episodes here and there, but I never really got into it. Yes, it was one of the major sitcoms that aired during the 90s, but my attentions were on other shows. It is on my list of retro shows that I plan to binge at some point in the future. So many shows, so many video games, and such little time to consume it all. Frasier was very successful, running for an impressive 11 seasons, winning a staggering 37 Primetime Emmy Awards. So it definitely takes its place amongst the greatest sitcoms ever shown.
Frasier has left the building.
90s TV shows continue to define what a great decade the 90s was. We had some stellar shows that came out this year. Beavers and Butthead took the world by storm. Even though the show was aimed at a mature audience, I still managed to watch the show whenever it came on. At one point you couldn't think of MTV and not think of Beavers and Butthead. A show about two lazy couch potato slackers who were not very popular with the ladies and spent most of their time in front of the TV, bobbing their heads to heavy metal tunes and their massive trademarks, their laughter.
Really? That's pretty cool. Yeah. TV rules. Yeah.
Now, whilst I did watch it back in the day, I can't say I remember specific episodes, just mainly the portions of the show with the two in front of the TV making crass jokes and making fun of society in general. They did go on to have their own movie, Beavis and Butthead Do America, which I am yet to watch. That's another one for the list. But hey, you can't think of the 1990s and not remember Beavis and Butthead.
Yeah. Money rule. Asswipe.
XFiles made its debut this year, a supernatural drama and thriller featuring two FBI agents, one in Agent Mulder who believes in the paranormal and that aliens not only exist but they walk amongst the human race. His partner Agent Scully, a medical doctor who analyzes the findings of Mulder even though she is very skeptical of the whole thing. The show had plenty of suspenseful and scary moments and was quite graphic at times, which made for an uncomfortable watch. Another show that I wasn't fully invested in, but it was everywhere being advertised and its iconic theme song was very catchy, so I would watch some episodes here and there, but then like other shows on this list, my attention was elsewhere. Terminator 2 star Robert Patrick would join the show much later on during its run. The show also revolved around Mulder and Scully's will they won't they relationship, which duly happens during the show's final season. The impact that it had cannot be overstated, as it went on to create two notable spin-offs in Millennium and The Lone Gunmen. It also jumped from the small screen to the big screen with two theatrical movie releases. The Man of Steel Superman flew onto the small screens this year with the fondly remembered Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, a kind of modern update on the George Reeves series from the 1950s. It wasn't so much an action show like a Smallville or Arrow or any of the Arrowverse shows, but more of a soap opera detective show with sci-fi effects, which don't quite hold up to today's standards. The main focus of the show was the romance between Lois and Clark. Lois falls in love with Superman, but unbeknownst to her, Supes was in her presence on an almost regular basis, disguised as Clark Kent, mild-mannered news reporter. That sounds so lame coming from me. And she had no interest in Clark whatsoever, initially. So it was just a big juggling act for Clark, living two separate lives. As I said earlier, it wasn't an action show, but a lot of love and a lot of drama involved. There was a great cliffhanger at the end of season 2, when Clark, after revealing his identity, asks Lois to marry him, and she doesn't give an answer. Then there was plenty of shenanigans involved, namely Clark's rival Lex Luthor, a clone of Lois Lane, and Lois losing her memories until eventually and finally Lois and Clark got married. The show ended on another cliffhanger with both seemingly becoming parents. Looking back on it, I did enjoy the show when it first aired, and I even enjoyed it in rewatches on DVD. It wasn't set so much in Superman folklore, hence the lack of Superman's most notorious villains outside of Lex Luthor. It was campy at times, it was funny, and very entertaining. I must say, after watching Smallville and all the Arrowverse shows, it doesn't hold up as well in my opinion, primarily due to the lack of action, and it's often ponderous and slow-paced, but it is still a nice show to look back on every now and again. And the leads, Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher, did a brilliant job of bringing the characters to life on the small screen, and they had great on-screen chemistry, which really helped with the success of the show. Rounding off the TV shows of the year, 1993 saw the third iteration of the Star Trek franchise, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, led by Benjamin Sisko. This show was a landmark as Avery Brooks depicted as the first black captain of the Star Trek franchise, bringing in some much needed and welcome diversity to the series. Now, unlike its predecessors, Star Trek and Star Trek Next Generation, the focal point was the space station Deep Space Nine floating in space, just a few miles off the giant wormhole which stood between Federation space and the Gamma Quadrant. I'm not the biggest Star Trek Trekkie, but all that sounded very nerdy. It was the next step in the Star Trek franchise, and it took certain plots from the Next Generation and expanded on them further in the show. It was also the first Star Trek show created that wasn't the brainchild of creator Gene Roddenberry, but his influence was all over the show. They introduced a whole new set of memorable characters, including Major Kira, Quark, Odo, Dr. Bashir, Jake Sisko, Sisko's son, Chief O'Brien, and Jadzia Dax. Lieutenant Worf of Star Trek Next Generation joined the show from season 3, and this is when I particularly grew fond of the show because of his presence. There was much more action and drama and lasting story arcs than ever before. I personally preferred the Next Generation, and after initial resistance, I really grew to like this show, and it became a classic among Star Trek fans and lovers in general of great sci-fi entertainment. Pro wrestling had been a staple of TV since the 60s and the 70s, and the 80s saw the rise of larger-than-life characters like Hulk Hogan, the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, the Macho Man Randy Savage, and the Ultimate Warrior. We were entering a new era of wrestling, and this year saw the debut of Bret the Hitman Hart, Shawn Michaels, Tatanka. Yes, you still had big guys like Razor Ramon, The Undertaker, and Big Daddy Cool Diesel, but it was the smaller guys who took center stage in the Night Wars. An era that is unprecedented in the wrestling business and will likely never happen again. But now the quality of the modern day shows, well, that's a whole other story. But still, nearly 3 decades long, a fantastic run. And that concludes part 2, but it's still not over yet because 1993 saw the releases and debuts of some excellent video games and cartoons. So please do join me in the third installment of...
It was the year 1993.